Exodus, like the rest of the Pentateuch, is not, in fact, just one story. Exodus is, in fact, three stories that have been interwoven, sometimes confusingly, into a single continuous narrative. And these stories come from three previously independent literary sources. So there were three Exodus stories, and they've been combined, right, interwoven like this, into one single Exodus story. These three literary sources in the book of Exodus we call P, J, we call them by letters. It's easier that way, though also confusing. We call them P, J, and E. I give them to you here in order of their appearance in Exodus. Each one of these stories, P, J, and E, each one of these sources has its own distinct understanding of what happened. They each tell this story in a unique way, not just in terms of their style, not just in terms of their theologies, though those too, but literally in terms of what happened, when, where, who, to whom, why and how. I think I got all the questions there. So each of these sources has its own version of the Exodus story. And when we ask, therefore, about the truth of the story of the Exodus, we kind of are stuck. Which one of those stories are we asking to be the true one? Why would we choose one over another? They can't all be true, since they conflict with each other regularly. But they are all biblical. Now, I cannot do a full rendering of this sort of notion of the text in our limited time and space together. But as we go along in the next few weeks, I will point out some of these contradictions and repetitions so that you can understand as we read why this text looks the way that it does, and so that we can observe the various ways that ancient Israelite authors imagined the past and imagined Israel's relationship with its deity, which is what the story is really about. I will, having said that I'm not going to do this at great length, I will, however, take a bit of time here to point out how this plays out just at the very beginning of the book, just so you have a sense of what we're up to. So here's the narrative conundrum that we face as we turn to the very first chapter of Exodus. We know that back in Genesis, God promised repeatedly, and in all of the literary sources of the text, promised that Israel would eventually become very numerous. Right? This is the promise to the patriarchs. I will make you a great nation, and I will make your offspring like the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky. Right? That promise is given multiple times. And the question we want to ask is, okay, when did the people in fact become very numerous? When did they go from family to nation? Which is really what that promise is about. When did it happen? Under what circumstances did it happen? And how does it relate to the Egyptian oppression of Israel here in the first chapter of Exodus? Now, the attentive reader may note that Exodus 1 contains three separate statements about Israel multiplying. Here they are. Exodus 1:7, the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them. Exodus 1:12, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. And 1:20, God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. Each of these statements occurs in a distinctive way, a distinctive setting. The first one of them, Exodus 1:7, despite most English translations, is actually in the Hebrew in the pluperfect. Not the Israelites became fruitful, but the Israelites had become fruitful. They had multiplied and grown strong. In other words, this verse isn't telling us something new. It's reminding us of something that has already happened. And for one of our sources in the Pentateuch, that's true. According to P, this happened back in Genesis 47:27. Israel settled in the land of Egypt, and they gained possessions and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. So for this author, Israel's multiplying, again, going from family to nation, precedes the beginning even of the book of Exodus, precedes Israel's being enslaved. In fact, is the reason that the Egyptians impose slavery on Israel, right? They have already become too big. That's one perspective. Multiplying first, then enslavement as a result. The second of these versions, Exodus 1:12, has the Israelites multiplying not before being enslaved, but actually, weirdly, as a result of being enslaved. Pharaoh in this story is worried that Israel will in fact become too numerous, right? Let's deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase. They haven't yet, right? But Pharaoh is sort of anticipates the danger of this large population. So Pharaoh enslaves them in order to prevent that from happening. But as the story tells us, it backfires. This is Jay's version of the story. And Jay's version of the story actually begins with a callback to Jay's story in Exodus. A new king arose over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. Right? It's in Jay that Joseph does all the great work for Pharaoh and is, honored for it. The idea of a new king forgetting Joseph's service is part of that story. So again, in P, we have the Israelites multiplying all the way back in Genesis and then being enslaved as a result. In J, we have Israelites being enslaved in order to prevent them from multiplying and becoming a great nation, but they do it anyway. Right? It's sort of a, not comeuppance for Pharaoh, but a reversal of his desires. And the third version of this in 120 is part of kind of a sort of entirely different little episode, which is the story of the midwives who saved the Israelite newborn males from being killed due to Pharaoh's decree. Now, even in a very broad way, the story of Pharaoh deciding to kill all of the Israelite newborn males never really made sense as part of a story about Pharaoh enslaving the Israelites in order to get labor out of them. If Pharaoh wants to enslave Israel and have them do work for him, then killing them off, which of course is what happens after one generation of killing all of the newborn males, killing off Israel seems dumb. So here in this account of the multiplying, which is from our E source, the oppression that Israel experiences in Egypt isn't slavery at all. It's genocide. And it's in the face of this genocide that Pharaoh is imposing on Israel. It's in the face of that genocide that Israel multiplies, right? Thanks to the midwives who, push back against Pharaoh's plans. Now, it is admittedly a little weird to imagine an Exodus story that didn't have slavery in it. But I'm here to tell you that that's just what E has. That's just how E tells the story, both here in Exodus 1 and in fact throughout. And just to jump ahead for a second as my little bit of extra evidence for this, we will in a few weeks eventually come to the law code in the book of Exodus in chapters 21 through 23, which we call the covenant code, which is also from E. And there in that law code, regular reference will be made to Israel's experience in Egypt, as in fact happens in most of the law codes, right? Where we might expect statements like, do X or Y, or, treat people well because you were slaves in the land of Egypt, which is exactly what we have, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy. Right? We have a explicit reference to Israel having been slaves, and therefore they have to take care of the vulnerable in their society. The parallel lines in E's version, in the covenant code, say, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It simply never says you were slaves. It's you were strangers. You're not allowed to oppress a stranger because you know the heart of a stranger. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. It's interesting that, again, here, it doesn't say slave, it says stranger, and nor does it say don't enslave a stranger. It says don't oppress, which is a relatively broad term that I think probably could cover genocide. So we're reckoning then, and I don't think we're going to come back to this again probably in the conversation, but it's nice to have it out there. One of the sources of the Pentateuch, E, simply doesn't think that Israel was enslaved in Egypt, which, is kind of crazy, right? Okay, so one of the tasks that lies ahead of us in our time here is to recognize that our Exodus story, the one that we sort of know and, Jews tell every year at Passover, and that gets, told again and again in movies and in books and in all kinds of cultural media. That Exodus story is, in fact, 3 Exodus stories, and they don't all agree with one another. And that's not just sort of a modern academic perspective or thing to say. It's actually an inherent part of the biblical text. Right? The biblical text that we have our sort of canonical Exodus story, couldn't and wouldn't exist if there weren't these 3 constituent parts making it up. So Exodus, like the rest of the Pentateuch, is a record of ancient Israel's disparate views on its own past. And that disparity, I'm suggesting, actually is what makes the text what it is. Not a single one of the sources of Exodus, not P, not J, and not E, tells the story as we're familiar with it. And this is a point I will come back to a couple of times more in our time together, as I point out places where, where as we unravel the threads, we discover stories that, look like but aren't quite, or we reveal things about perspectives, like here in where E doesn't think that there's slavery. You would never know that. You would never know that someone in ancient Israel thought that Israel wasn't enslaved in Egypt unless we did this kind of analysis and work. None of these sources, again, tells the story that we're familiar with, but the story we're familiar with is an amalgam of all of them. But each of them, I'm going to suggest, represents a perspective on this story that is worth understanding, and again, that contributes to the whole.